11:47 p.m. Eastern Syria. The U.S. forward operating position at Mission Support Site Koniko sat on the eastern bank of the Euphrates River, 12 kilometers northeast of the Deir ez-Zor gas field infrastructure. It was not a large installation, a compound of 11 structures on approximately 3.4 hectares of fortified ground, housing a rotating element of U.S. Special Operations personnel and their partnered Syrian Democratic Forces counterparts. Its purpose was persistent intelligence collection and partner force advising in a sector where Iranian-backed networks had been consolidating supply route access since 2021. It had been at that location, in that function, for 3 years. The personnel at the site knew every vehicle track and footpath within 8 kilometers. They also knew that the road from the south had been showing anomalous vehicle activity for 48 hours. The 48 hours before the breach had been a study in the gap between observation and understanding. The MQ-9 that had been logging the vehicle movements was not assigned exclusively to Koniko surveillance. It was operating a sector route that included 9 separate points of interest across the Deir ez-Zor region, each receiving periodic dwell time as the orbit cycled. The Koniko approach road received approximately 22 minutes of dwell per hour. The other 38 minutes were allocated to other points of interest where the analytical priority had been assessed as equal or higher. In the 48 hours before the breach, the MQ-9 had captured 14 anomalous vehicle movements in 22 minutes of dwell per hour. The number of movements that had occurred during the other 38 minutes of each hour was not known. The picture was partial, consistent with a pattern, and insufficient on its own for an emergency escalation above the indeterminate intent assessment threshold. The intelligence system had functioned correctly. The information it produced had been accurate. The picture it showed was a portion of a larger picture that the collection architecture had not been positioned to capture in full. The anomalous activity had been flagged in 2 separate intelligence products over the preceding 2 days. An MQ-9 Reaper conducting persistent surveillance over the Deir ez-Zor road network had logged 14 vehicle movements by unfamiliar pickup trucks between a known Kataib Hezbollah logistics node at the Al-Mayadeen Junction and a position 4.3 kilometers south of the Koniko site over a 31-hour window. The vehicles were not military. They carried no visible heavy equipment. The movement pattern was not consistent with the supply run. The vehicles arrived, remained stationary for between 40 and 90 minutes, and departed without offloading anything the MQ-9's electro-optical sensors could identify. The intelligence product's assessment line had used the phrase pattern of life anomaly, indeterminate intent. The second product from a SIGINT collection asset operating over the sector had flagged an increase in encrypted short-range radio communications in the same geographic area. Communications on frequencies previously associated with Kataib Hezbollah operational coordination, but using a newer encryption protocol that the collection system had not yet fully characterized. Indeterminate intent, newer encryption protocol. 48 hours of watching something that did not yet resolve into a clear picture. At 11:47 and 9 seconds p.m., the picture resolved. The vehicle-borne explosive charge that breached the Koniko site's southern perimeter wall was assessed post-incident as containing between 800 and 1,100 kilograms of mixed explosive compound, sufficient to create a 4-meter gap in the reinforced concrete perimeter. The breach was followed within 11 seconds by a coordinated entry from 3 separate directions. The southern breach point, a scaling party on the eastern wall, and a third element cutting through the western wire barrier simultaneously. The force had been pre-positioned in the surrounding terrain during the 48 hours of vehicle activity that the MQ-9 had observed. Not supplies, personnel. The Kataib Hezbollah element that entered the Koniko compound numbered approximately 34 fighters based on subsequent analysis of entry points and movement patterns. Their objective, as assessed from the communications intercepts that began appearing in clear text on monitored frequencies within minutes of the breach, was not to engage U.S. personnel directly. Their objective was to establish physical control of a portion of the compound containing 4 U.S. Special Operations personnel, who had been isolated from the main building cluster by the initial breach detonation. Isolated in a structure on the southern edge of the compound, 80 meters from the main personnel shelter where the remaining 14 U.S. and SDF personnel had consolidated. 4 personnel in a structure, with a wall between them and the rest of the force. The Kataib network's communications within the first 8 minutes of the operation made the strategic logic explicit. The transmissions, intercepted in real time by the SIGINT asset that had been monitoring the sector and transmitted to CENTCOM within 40 seconds of each message, described the 4 isolated personnel as leverage. The word used was not detained personnel in any conventional military sense. The framing was positional. The compound is ours. The personnel are within our perimeter. Any U.S. response that involves ordnance will resolve the situation in a way that Washington cannot explain to its public. The calculation was precise and had been tested against U.S. behavior patterns in the region for 3 years. Every previous Kataib operation in eastern Syria that had placed U.S. personnel in proximity to a potential kinetic response zone had produced a pause in the U.S. decision cycle. A pause was what the operation was designed to create. The pause was also what was being denied at CENTCOM at 11:52 p.m., 5 minutes after the breach. The CENTCOM Operations Watch Team had the full communications picture within 4 minutes of the initial breach. The SIGINT asset's direct feed to the operations floor. The Koniko site's own internal radio transmissions from the consolidated group in the main shelter describing the breach, and the MQ-9 Reaper's electro-optical feed, which was already repositioning to provide overhead coverage of the compound at the moment of the detonation. By 11:52 p.m., the watch team had the following confirmed. 4 U.S. personnel isolated in the southern structure, 14 U.S. and SDF personnel consolidated in the main shelter, an estimated 34 fighter Kataib element in physical control of approximately 60% of the compound, and a coordinated messaging operation already transmitting on monitored frequencies to ensure that CENTCOM understood the positional leverage the Kataib element believed it held. The watch team also had something the Kataib element did not know they had. 15 months earlier, the Koniko site had undergone a security upgrade that had included the installation of a network of acoustic and seismic sensors embedded in the compound's interior surfaces and subsurface. A system that, when combined with the overhead MQ-9 feed, produced a near-complete positional picture of every individual within the compound to within approximately 2 meters of accuracy. The system had been installed after a 2022 incident at a different site in the region where a surprise entry had created exactly the kind of uncertainty that limited U.S. response options. The lesson had been learned. The system had been fielded. At 11:52 p.m., the CENTCOM operations floor had a live positional feed showing the location of the 4 isolated U.S. personnel, the 14 in the main shelter, and the movement patterns of the approximately 34 Kataib fighters within the compound, updated every 8 seconds. The Kataib element held positional leverage over 4 individuals they believed they had isolated from U.S. observation. They did not know that their own positions, movements, and concentrations were being tracked with near precision from 2 independent sensor systems simultaneously. The deliberate response option that activated at 11:54 p.m. was not a conventional fire mission. CENTCOM's Special Operations Command had maintained a direct action contingency plan for the Koniko site since its establishment. A plan that had been updated 3 times in 36 months as the site's layout, personnel count, and surrounding threat environment evolved. The plan designated the scenario currently in progress as a Category Alpha compound entry, defined as an adversary force in physical possession of a U.S. installation with U.S. personnel in a constrained position, and assigned it a specific response architecture that emphasized precision over speed, personnel recovery over facility clearance, and the absolute avoidance of any ordnance employment within the compound perimeter as a first-order constraint. The Category Alpha plan did not call for a standoff engagement. It called for a direct insertion. 2 MH-60M Black Hawk helicopters from the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment had been on 30-minute alert at a forward arming and refueling point 47 kilometers northwest of Koniko since the anomalous vehicle activity report had been issued 48 hours earlier. Not because the Category Alpha scenario had been assessed as imminent, because the anomalous activity report had elevated the site's readiness tier, and elevated readiness tier at a Koniko-class installation automatically moved the 161st element from 2-hour to 30-minute alert. The elevation had happened at 9:14 a.m., 38 hours before the breach. The crew had been at 30-minute alert for 38 hours. At 11:54 p.m., the 30-minute alert became an execute order. The MH-60Ms were airborne at 11:56:22 p.m. 7 minutes and 13 seconds after the initial breach. Flight time to Koniko at nap of Earth profile approximately 19 minutes. During those 19 minutes, 3 parallel processes ran simultaneously. The MQ-9 overhead feed updated the compound positional picture every 8 seconds throughout the flight. By 12:04 a.m., 6 minutes into the recovery flight, the positional analysis had identified that the Kataib element had concentrated the majority of its force in 2 clusters. One group of approximately 19 fighters occupying the central compound area around the main administrative building, and a second group of approximately 11 fighters maintaining the perimeter breach and eastern wall positions. 4 fighters were assessed as being in direct proximity to the southern structure where the isolated U.S. personnel were located, within 12 meters of the structure's entrance. The second parallel process was an electronic warfare operation. An EC-130H Compass Call aircraft that had been orbiting 180 kilometers west of Koniko on a routine electronic surveillance mission was redirected at 11:55 p.m. to a holding pattern that placed it within effective range of the Kataib element's radio network. At 12:01 a.m., the EC-130H began targeted jamming of the specific frequency ranges the Kataib element was using for internal coordination. Not a broadband jamming operation, a surgical suppression of the specific encrypted short-range network that SIGINT had been monitoring. The effect was not to silence the network completely, but to degrade its reliability sufficiently that the Kataib force's internal coordination became unreliable. Messages that took 2 seconds to transmit began taking 18 to 31 seconds with frequent retransmission requests. The Kataib command element, receiving inconsistent and delayed reports from its dispersed fighters, began making positional decisions based on information that was between 30 seconds and 2 minutes old at the time of receipt. The communication suppression produced effects that compounded over time in ways that a simple signal degradation metric did not capture. In the first 4 minutes of EC-130H jamming, the Kataib element's command structure made 4 decisions based on position reports that were between 30 and 90 seconds out of date by the time the decisions were transmitted back to the element's subordinate positions. One of those decisions moved a 5-fighter group from the eastern wall positioned toward the southern structure. A movement that, when it arrived, found the southern structure already in a different tactical situation than the one the command had ordered the movement to address. The group stopped, held position for 44 seconds waiting for clarification that the jamming delayed, and then began moving back toward the eastern wall. They were in transit, not in a defensive position at either end, at the moment the MH-60Ms arrived overhead. The EC-130H had not neutralized the Kataib element's communications. It had made them unreliable enough that the element's tactical decisions began chasing a situation that had already changed by the time the decisions executed. The third parallel process was the suppression of any external reinforcement. A second MQ-9 Reaper that had been operating in the wider Deir ez-Zor sector repositioned at 11:58 p.m. to a surveillance orbit covering the road network south and southeast of Koniko. The approach vectors from the Al Mayadeen junction where the Kataib logistics node was located. The MQ-9 was authorized under pre-delegated rules of engagement to engage any armed vehicle formation moving toward the Koniko site from those vectors. The authorization was specific: armed formation moving toward the site within a defined geographic trigger zone. 2 technical vehicles, pickup trucks with crew-served weapons mounted in the bed, departed the Al Mayadeen junction at 12:06 a.m. on a heading consistent with approach to Koniko. They entered the trigger zone at 12:08 a.m. The MQ-9 engaged both vehicles with AGM-114 Hellfire at 12:08:34 a.m. Both vehicles were rendered non-operational. No reinforcement reached the site. The MH-60Ms arrived over Koniko at 12:15:19 a.m., 27 minutes and 10 seconds after the initial breach. The recovery insertion used the compound's northern landing zone, a cleared area 60 meters from the main shelter where the 14 consolidated personnel were located, and 140 meters from the southern structure where the 4 isolated personnel remained. The northern zone had been selected because the positional picture showed no Kataib fighters within 35 meters of it at the moment of arrival. The Kataib element had not anticipated a northern insertion. Their defensive concentration was on the eastern and southern positions, consistent with their expectation of a response from the direction of U.S. conventional forces at the Al Omar oil field base 28 kilometers to the north. The EC-130H jamming meant that the Kataib forces' internal communication of the helicopter arrival took 31 seconds to reach the southern structure group from the fighters who first observed the MH-60Ms. 31 seconds in which the assault element from the first helicopter moved from the landing zone to the main shelter, confirmed the 14 consolidated personnel, and began the sequence for the southern structure recovery. The 4 fighters assessed as being in proximity to the southern structure had, by the time the assault element reached them, consolidated inside the structure's entrance corridor, a position that the acoustic sensor network confirmed at 12:15:44 a.m. The assault element's approach to the southern structure took 94 seconds. The entry into the structure took 11 seconds. The recovery of all 4 isolated U.S. personnel was confirmed at 12:17:22 a.m. No ordnance was employed within the compound perimeter at any point during the recovery sequence. No U.S. personnel sustained injuries during the recovery. 4 Kataib fighters in the southern structure were placed in custody and moved to the extraction helicopters. The Kataib forces' remaining elements, which had begun moving toward the southern structure at 12:15:52 a.m., when the EC-130H jamming briefly cleared on one frequency and allowed a partial alarm transmission, arrived at the southern structure at 12:18:07 a.m. The U.S. force and all personnel had departed the structure 45 seconds earlier. The MH-60Ms departed the Koniko compound at 12:18:31 a.m. On departure, a pair of F-15E Strike Eagles that had been holding at altitude 90 kilometers south since 12:02 a.m., pre-positioned as overwatch for the recovery operation, executed a low-altitude supersonic pass over the compound at 12:18:44 a.m., 13 seconds after the helicopters cleared the perimeter. The pass was not a munitions employment. It was a signal. The Kataib element remaining in the compound received it as intended. The total timeline from initial breach to recovery force departure, 31 minutes and 22 seconds. U.S. personnel in the compound at breach, 18, including 4 isolated. U.S. personnel recovered 18 of 18. U.S. personnel injuries 2, minor from the initial breach detonation sustained before the response force arrived. Kataib fighters in custody 4. MQ-9 vehicle engagements on approach roads, 2 of 2 neutralized. EC-130H jamming effectiveness, Internal Kataib coordination degraded to 30-second minimum latency for 23 minutes. Ordnance employed within compound perimeter 0. F-15E Overwatch ordnance employed 0. Compound status: Kataib element occupying 60% of facility at recovery force departure. U.S. personnel no longer present. The facility was not the objective. The personnel were the objective. At 12:44 a.m., CENTCOM authorized a second operation. The Kataib element that had conducted the Koniko breach had come from a pre-positioning location that the 48 hours of MQ-9 surveillance had partially documented. A staging area 4.3 kilometers south of the site, near a road junction that imagery had shown as the terminus point for the vehicle movements logged over the preceding days. That staging area was a military target, a force that had conducted a deliberate operation against a U.S. installation and was now concentrated in a documented position. Operation Eastern Account activated at 12:44 a.m. The two F-15Es that had been holding as Overwatch expended their precision ordnance package against the staging area coordinates at 12:47 a.m. Secondary imagery collected by the repositioned MQ-9 at 12:52 a.m. showed the staging area non-operational. Time from Koniko breach to completion of Eastern Account, 65 minutes. U.S. personnel recovered, 18 of 18. Kataib staging area, non-operational. Intelligence collected during the operation. Communications intercepts. 4 personnel in custody and positional data from the acoustic sensor network that had documented the full movement pattern of the 34 fighter element throughout the 31-minute compound occupation. The intelligence product from those 31 minutes was classified and distributed within 90 minutes of the recovery force's departure. The Kataib network's operational security protocols, the encrypted frequency assignments, and the force composition indicators. All of it documented by sensors that the Kataib element had not known were present and had operated within for 31 minutes believing they were unobserved. The leverage calculation that had framed the Kataib operation was not wrong on its face. U.S. decision cycles in scenarios where U.S. personnel were in proximity to potential kinetic response zones had historically paused. The calculation had failed to account for 2 variables that had been introduced into the response architecture after the previous pause cycles had been analyzed. The acoustic sensor network that eliminated the positional uncertainty that caused pauses, and the 30-minute alert posture of the 161st element that compressed the response timeline to within the window where positional data remained actionable. The pause the operation was designed to create had lasted 5 minutes and 48 seconds. That was the interval between the CENTCOM watch team receiving the full picture at 11:52 p.m. and the execute order transmitting at 11:54 p.m., 5 minutes and 48 seconds. The leverage window the Kataib operation had been designed to exploit had been architected to be indefinite. The CENTCOM watch team had closed it in the time it took most organizations to convene a conference call. The closure was not a function of faster reflexes or better personnel. It was a function of 2 pieces of infrastructure that had been installed in response to specific operational failures in the preceding 36 months. The acoustic sensor network that eliminated positional uncertainty and the pre-delegated alert posture that eliminated the time lost to re-establishing a readiness status the force had already been maintaining for 38 hours. The Kataib operation was more sophisticated than the operations that had preceded it in the region. It had used an unfamiliar encryption protocol. It had employed a cover story for its pre-positioning. It had correctly identified the decision cycle pause that U.S. force protection constraints historically created. 3 years of operational experience against U.S. behavior in eastern Syria had produced an operation that addressed the vulnerabilities that 3 years of U.S. operational experience had failed to patch. The specific failure being addressed by the Kataib plan, the pause in U.S. decision-making when personnel were in proximity to potential kinetic response zones, had been genuine. It had been genuine until 15 months ago. The sensor network and the 161st alert posture had closed it. The Kataib organization had not known that. They had planned against the vulnerability as it had existed. The vulnerability no longer existed in the form they had planned against. 5 minutes and 48 seconds. The leverage window the Kataib operation had been designed to exploit had been architected to be indefinite. The response architecture that closed it had been built over 15 months, at a cost that did not appear in any public budget document and had not generated any public announcement. The lesson that 3 years of operational experience in eastern Syria had produced had been absorbed, funded, and fielded before the night that it was needed.